Good evening. Welcome to today's program, Beyond the Exhibit, Breaking the Military Color Barrier. This is the third in a series of programs presented this year by the Glencoe Historical Society. Part 1 explored Black settlement in Glencoe in the 1880s and 1890s. Part 2 focused on why Glencoe's Black population began to decline in the 1920s and 30s. Today's program is being presented live at the library as well as live streamed via Zoom, and it's also being recorded and will be placed on our YouTube channel within a couple of days. I'd like to make a special shout out to the members of the Glencoe Historical Society who are in the audience with us today, and also to the members of the Glencoe Council for Inclusion and Community who are also with us back there. Welcome, and I'm glad you're here. If you've not already done so, I encourage you to experience the GHS's remarkable Black Heritage exhibit that this program series complements. The exhibit opened in September 2022 and is based on, right? Okay, 22. And is based on 5 years of special research. If to visit it, you can go to the Historical Society by appointment or on Wednesdays from 10 to 3 and Sundays 1 to 4. And it will be up until at least next spring, I believe. Right? Our presenter tonight is Karen Edelson, who's co-president of the Historical Society. On behalf of the Glencoe community, I'd like to thank the entire GHS research team, many of whom are here today, whose members have volunteered so much energy and creativity in their mission to discover and convey our village's past. Thank you, GHS. Karen, thank you, and I'll let you get started now.
Thanks very much. I want to echo Grace's thanks, particularly to the GHS board and to our research team. The exhibit is based on 5 years of research, and a lot of the people who did that, Peggy Hamill, Barb Ollinger, Mary Osmitz, Dan Goodwin isn't here tonight, but all of these people have worked very long and hard, and while I may be the mouthpiece here, they have all contributed, and we really owe everyone a debt of thanks. Tonight's program is entitled Breaking the Military Color Barrier. And what we want to do in this program is we want to understand how Glencoe residents helped break the military color barrier in World War II and we're doing this through the personal stories of these 4 extraordinary men who you see on the screen. On the far left is Roger Brown. Next to him is William Loving. Then is Frank Sublett. And on the far right, the handsome guy in the pit hat is Wilson Rankin. I also want to preface this program with a little note that we're going to be a little more scripted tonight than ordinarily. And the reason for that is I want you to hear these experiences in the words of the people who live them. Not my words, their words. And I think it's really important that you hear their words. And with that, I'm also going to warn you that in some instances, their words are going to be jarring and words and terminology that we might not use today. But again, I think to really fully understand the contribution of these men and what they did in helping to break the military color barrier, we need to hear those words as they were spoken. So we're going to start. I'm going to start by trying to place everything in a little bit of context, and I want to go very quickly through a brief kind of history of Black Army service. And we're going to go back all the way to the Revolutionary War, where more than 5,000 African-American troops made up both of freemen and of slaves fought in the Continental Army. Both the Americans and the British promised slaves their freedom for taking up arms against the enemy, although that promise was often broken, as you can guess. The first casualty of the American Revolution was Crispus Attucks, who's pictured here, a man of African and Natick Indian descent. Attucks was shot and killed by British troops at the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1770. Although black militiamen fought at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, state legislatures and the Continental Congress forbade the enlistment of free blacks and slaves. Many white Americans opposed admitting African Americans to the Army for fear of armed uprisings. George Washington, in November of 1775, issued an order to bar black soldiers from the Continental Army. However, in January 1776, he reconsidered and permitted reenlistment of black soldiers. And despite regulations, black soldiers from almost every state were mustered into the American forces. Within a couple of years, it became clear that the colonies were unable to fulfill their enlistment quotas, so the northern states began to recruit free and eventually enslaved men. And in many cases, slaves were promised freedom in exchange for service. Some states allowed slaveholders to send their slaves to the front in their place, or to collect their enlistment bounties. Southern states, still fearful of slave uprisings, only permitted free men to serve in the Continental Army. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment, I picture them here because they were an integrated unit composed of African Americans, Native Americans, and white soldiers who served together from 1778 through the end of the war in 1783. And then we get to the Militia Act of 1792, where Congress, in its wisdom, said that each and every free, able-bodied white male citizen who was at least 18 and under the age of 45 had to enroll in the militia. By the War of 1812, black soldiers were still in service, though, both in integrated regiments as well as in all-black regiments. Many worked as laborers, construction fortifiers, and supplying the army with food, materials, and munitions. There were 2 battalions of, quote, free men of color, unquote, who participated in the American victory over British at the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the war. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 officially sanctioned the enlistment of black soldiers into the Union Army and the Navy, but not the Marines. Remember that, because we're going to come back to that. Black soldiers joined the segregated regiments of the United States Colored Troops, which eventually made up 10% of Union forces. More than 186,000 African Americans, including 94,000 former slaves from Confederate states, ultimately served in the Union Army. The Civil War also found a substantial number of blacks serving with the Union Army in particular, some of them from the freed northern states and others who had escaped slavery in the South. What's pictured on this particular screen is an enlistment poster on the right that calls black men to service in the Union Army and promises service and payment. In some instances, again, freedom was promised, but in many instances, that didn't happen. The Indian Wars after the Civil War in the West were also a prominent battlefield for many African American troops. The American Plains Indians who fought against these soldiers referred to them as buffalo soldiers because of their dark curly hair, which to the Indians resembled a buffalo's coat, and also because of the fierce nature of their fighting. And the nickname soon became synonymous with all African American regiments formed after 1866 and even through the First World War. The Spanish-American War, the book on your right, called The Black Troopers by Miles V. Links, details the bravery of black troops in Teddy Roosevelt's campaign. In contrast to Roosevelt's text, which implies that black troops needed white leadership to succeed, Links asserts that the importance of having black troops at the front who were experienced in guerrilla warfare from their time in the West was critical to saving many white soldiers' lives. During World War I, more than 1 million African Americans responded to the draft and served in the armed forces. Despite racial discrimination in the military, more than 200,000 African Americans served in France. Most troops served in service units rather than in combat. Several divisions did see combat, including the 92nd and 93rd Divisions, who were borrowed by the French. The French found them more than capable. In 1925, there was a classified report. It was 7 years after the end of World War I. The Army War College undertook a study to evaluate the fitness of black soldiers for service in a future war. The study's recommendation emphasized the importance of white officers and strict segregation of black troops. It was generally dubious about the prospects of black soldiers serving successfully in combat roles. These are a few quotes from that report. Black men are very low in the scale of human evolution. The cranial activity of the Negro is smaller than the white, and his brain weighs less. The Southern Negro did not have the stamina to thrive in cold, rigorous climates during wartime. The Negro is by nature subservient and believes himself to be inferior to the white man. He is most susceptible to the influence of crowd psychology. He cannot control himself in the face of danger to the extent the white man can. He has not the initiative and the resourcefulness of the white man. He is mentally inferior to the white man. It's important to recognize that this report was an official document of the U.S. Army, and its words helped to form its segregationist policies for many years. We now get to breaking the military color barrier in the Army, and that is the Tuskegee Airmen. It is surprising in light of the quotes that I just read you from that 1925 report that the Army Air Corps did capitulate to pressure from the black population and political groups and gave the okay to set up a base to train black men to be military pilots. And these pilots were the Tuskegee Airmen. Senator Harry Schwartz, a longtime proponent of recruiting blacks into the Air Corps, introduced an amendment to an appropriations bill in 1939 that included funding for any accredited civilian aviation school to train any Negro air pilot. Tuskegee in Alabama, a home to a civilian pilot training program, took advantage of the funding and started a civilian program for black pilots. In January of 1941, Secretary of the Army Henry L. Stimson authorized the formation of a Black Pursuit Squadron. On March 22, 1941, the 99th Pursuit, later Fighter Squadron, was activated without pilots at Chinook Field in Rantoul, Illinois. A cadre of 14 black non-commissioned officers from the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments were sent to Chinook Field to help in the administration and supervision of the trainees. A white officer was assigned as the first commander, and a group of 271 enlisted men began training in aircraft ground support trades, not as pilots. In March of 1941, the whole program got a boost. Eleanor Roosevelt went down to inspect the civil air program at Tuskegee. She said, "I've always heard colored people can't fly, but I see them flying around here." Much to the chagrin of her Secret Service, she decided she wanted to go up in one of the planes and ended up taking a half-an-hour flight with one of the flight instructors and came back and told the press, "Well, they sure can fly all right." A couple of months later, on June 25, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802. You're going to hear about this several times tonight. This order bans discriminatory employment practices by federal agencies, union, and companies engaged in war-related work. This opened the door for blacks to enter the Army Military Air Corps. And on July 19, 1941, the Tuskegee experiment, they called it, began. This was when the 99th Pursuit Squadron from Rantoul transferred down to Tuskegee, Alabama, and started to train blacks as pilots. And that brings us to Glencoe's Roger B. Brown. Roger Brown was born in 1917, the youngest of 4 sons in the family of Thomas and Etta Brown. His father, Thomas Brown, was an insurance salesman, and his mother, Etta, ran an employment business. His grandparents, Nellie and Marshall Craig, operated the grocery store at Madison and Randolph, which was later known as Parentes. Roger was a member of the Central School class of 1931. Like his brother Tom, a well-known jazz drummer, Roger enjoyed music. He was noted for his singing talent and joined the choir at St. Paul AME Church as a child. He was later a frequent soloist. Roger was in the New Trier graduating class of 1935. His senior yearbook indicates that he was active in intramural sports and was also a good student. Roger registered for the draft on October 10th, 1940. At the time, he was living at 338 Washington Street with his wife, Mabel O'Kelly, and he was unemployed. He enlisted in the Army October 5th, 1942, and applied for testing to become a cadet pilot. He was accepted into the Tuskegee Institute in February of 1943. These photos show on the left the barracks at Tuskegee at the time, and on the right, this was an inspection of those barracks by the commanding officer. On November 3rd, 1943, Roger Brown was awarded his wings and also commissioned as a second lieutenant. His Tuskegee class was part of the first graduating class that included bomber pilots. Lieutenant Brown was trained for single-engine aircraft. The graduation address was given by T.M. Campbell, who was a Department of Agriculture official, but was also the father of two sons who were in the armed forces and a daughter who was in the WAC. He told the graduates, I'm quoting, "The courage, skill, and precision in which you have exhibited during your period of training here will not only be of great inspiration to those following in your footsteps, but will command the respect and admiration of both races of people in this immediate community, this state, this region, this nation, and other parts of the world where you may chance to go." Roger was assigned to the 100th Fighter Squadron, the 332nd Fighter Group, which was based at Ramitelli Air Force Base in Italy. This was a small base on the Adriatic coast. And he showed his skill on May 28th, 1944, when he successfully landed a B-38 Airacobra at sea, not where he was supposed to land it. I'm going to quote from the description of what happened. During a training mission on May 28, 1944, the engine in the plane of Lieutenant Roger B. Brown of Glencoe, Illinois, conked out while he was flying 2,000 feet above the water. After unsuccessfully attempting to start the engine, Brown found himself only 800 feet above the water and falling too fast to jump with his parachute. He jettisoned the doors of his P-39 Airacobra, unfastened everything he could, cut off his switches, placed his hands over his gun sight, and held his plane off the water until his airspeed was less than 120 miles per hour. When his ship hit the water, he abandoned it in less than 3 seconds. Yet despite his swiftness in getting out, the tail of his fast-sinking plane struck him. Lieutenant Brown was rescued by a British vessel shortly thereafter. For his accomplishment, he was officially commended for being the first pilot in the United States Air Force known to have successfully crash-landed a P-39 Airacobra at sea. That's the plane you see there on the picture. In July of 1944, the people in Glencoe were shocked and saddened by the report that Lieutenant Roger Brown was missing in action. This usually happens well after the incident that caused the pilot to be missing. And what had happened was he was killed in action on June 14th of 1944. The statement of the witness reads, "On June 14th, 1944, at 16:20 hours, I was leading a two-ship flight of P-47s on a training flight. Lieutenant Brown was flying my wing, and I noticed him dropping back. At the same time, I throttled back, and I noticed his ship was smoking an decreasing to a dense black smoke. He then was losing altitude. I told him to bail out, but I did not see him jump due to scattered clouds and haze. I saw his plane hit the ground and burst into flames. I circled 3 times trying to give the mayday and transmitting for a fix. I then headed for home. There was a search flight that was sent out shortly thereafter. You see on the right the map that shows where the crash happened. The picture on the left shows the very mountainous terrain in the mountains of Italy where Lieutenant Brown crashed. There was a memorial service held at St. Paul AME in November of 1944. He was sorely missed by the choir that sang with him every Sunday before he left for Italy. His legacy: he was one of 992 pilots trained at Tuskegee. He was one of 335 pilots deployed overseas, and one of only 84 who made the ultimate sacrifice. It is unclear, but it does not appear that a body was ever recovered. Nevertheless, there is a marker in the Sicily-Rome American Cemetery in Nettuno, Italy, honoring Lieutenant Brown, and he is remembered each Memorial Day here in Glencoe. We are also fortunate in Glencoe to have 2 out of those 992 Tuskegee airmen who resided in our village. Roger Brown grew up here. William Loving moved here after the war and spent the majority of his post-war life here in Glencoe. In 1922, he was born in Oak Park, and his father worked for a chauffeur for a family there. William remembered that the hospital, or at least he was told, the hospital in Oak Park wouldn't treat colored people at that time, so his father had to drive his mother to a hospital in Chicago to have him as a baby. He grew up in the city. He was a graduate of Hyde Park High School, class of 1935. He then joined the Army Signal Corps Reserves. He was sent to basic training in Salt Lake City at Camp Kearns. Was there, he passed an exam for aviation cadets, and then he was sent to Tuskegee for pre-flight training. His training was extensive. He traveled to Florida for gunnery school, where he trained as a nose gunner in a B-24 bomber. He said he was too big to fit in the turrets, so he sat behind a plexiglass shield in the very front of the plane with 2 50 caliber machine guns, and he said it was exciting. In Texas, he trained as an aerial navigator and was commissioned as second lieutenant in the Army, and then he went to bombardier school. He was awarded his wings in 1945 and his commission at the airfield in Texas. And then came a bureaucratic mix-up that brought home a very sobering reality. Loving, along with 7 other African-American officers, was mistakenly classified as white and transferred to the Air Transport Command at Wright and Patterson Fields near Dayton. They didn't want us there, Loving remembers. All we did was fly just enough hours to get our pay. They didn't assign us any other duties. And when we went into the officers' mess hall, none of the white officers wanted to sit with us. They wanted to keep us segregated. So, one day, we went in, and each of us sat at a different table. In order to eat, the white officers had to sit with us. After a few months, Loving and his fellow black officers were transferred to the Army Air Force 477 Medium Bombardment Group at Godman Field in Kentucky. And although the group was never called to active duty overseas, Loving and the bomber crews flew numerous training missions and also performed at air shows. After the war, Loving served in the Air Force Reserve, eventually reaching the rank of captain. His son also became a pilot and flies commercially. On March 29, 2007, about 300 surviving Tuskegee airmen were honored in Washington, D.C., where the group was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. William Loving was among them. It was a grand ceremony, said Loving. I saw some of the pilots I'd flown with, people I hadn't seen since the 1940s. We recognized each other right away. It was very emotional. And I might add, his wife, Christine, worked here at the library for many years.
President of the board.
She was president of the library board. Now we're going to switch, now that you've seen the contribution that two Glencoe residents made to breaking the color barriers in the Army Air Corps, we're going to switch to the Navy. And I'm going to give you a little background again on kind of black service in the Navy. Back to the Revolution, over 10% of the Continental Navy was African American during the American Revolution, a higher percentage than in the ground services. Even greater numbers of African Americans served aboard state naval vessels and privateers. In the War of 1812, blacks represented 1/6 of the naval personnel in the conflict. They distinguished themselves in the Battle of Lake Erie and other significant campaigns. Most people don't think about ships in the Civil War, but blacks constituted approximately 25% of the Navy's enlisted force in the Civil War. At that time, mariners often moved back and forth between the Navy and commercial services. The Navy was willing to take whomever it could get. Still, most black sailors were in cook and servant type roles or in engineering ratings such as machinist mate or oiler. One very important story that's shown on this slide is that of Robert Smalls. During the early hours of May 13, 1862, Robert Smalls, slave and pilot of the Confederate Army transport CSS Planter, secretly commandeered the ship with the assistance of other crew members and delivered it to the Union forces after sailing the vessel out of Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. Not only did he slip past the guns of 5 Confederate forts undetected, but he also delivered to the stunned Union forces blockading Charleston the Planter's captain's code book containing Confederate signals and a map of mine locations in Charleston's harbor. While Small's voyage obviously served as an unexpected victory for the Union, it also brought freedom to the Planter's other black enslaved crew members who brought their families on board. As a result, if you've ever been to Great Lakes Naval Training Center, and we'll talk about it a little more in a few minutes, the African American Training Center at Great Lakes was named after Robert Smalls. In the Spanish-American War, despite the onset of Jim Crow laws, blacks were still recruited for the Navy in sizable numbers, 9.5% of the enlistments in 1890 alone. For the most part, they messed and berthed with shipmates from a variety of other races and ethnicities, including white sailors, Japanese, Chinese, and Filipinos. After the war, Navy recruiting practices changed. The service inaugurated a category called Landsmen for Training. In this program, the Navy would take civilians without maritime backgrounds and would train them for naval duty. Men across the country became eligible for naval service, and it was no longer necessary to enlist black sailors. Blacks still worked in food service jobs and cared for officers, but it was essentially a segregated service because black sailors were likely to live and work in restricted enclaves on board ship rather than being spread throughout the ship's crews. As time passed, the Navy also decided that it would prefer to have servants from some race other than blacks, taking in Chinese and Filipinos as cooks and stewards. During World War I, the Navy became enlightened and accepted women. In 1917, they were known as yeomen, and the woman on the right here is Loretta Perfectus Walsh, a civilian clerk at the Philadelphia Recruiting Center. She became the first woman to enlist in the Naval Reserves. More women followed, and by the end of World War I, 11,880 women had enlisted. 6,750 black sailors served in the Navy during the First World War. That's 1.2% of the Navy's total enlistment. But they were only allowed to serve as coal heavers, messmen, stewards, and clerks. Between 1919 and 1939, the Navy suspended black recruitment altogether. Because officers believed that Filipinos made better messmen than blacks, the Navy suspended its enlistment, and those black sailors who had joined before August of 1919 were allowed to serve out until their retirement. The changing status of the Philippines in the 1930s, though, led the Navy to resume recruitment of blacks. They were a little worried that something might happen in the Philippines and they'd lose their recruitment of Filipino enlistments. In 1932, there were only 441 black sailors in the Navy, half of 1% of the force. This leads us to breaking the color barrier in the Navy. They were called the Golden 13. And one of them was Glencoe's Frank Sublett. Frank Sublett was born in Murfreesboro, Tennessee on March 5th, 1920, but at a very early age, his family moved to Illinois. He was in the Central School class of 1934. You can see him in the back row, right? He's like fourth or fifth. He was also a graduate of New Trier in the class of 1938. And here's the way he described that experience. I went to school here in Glencoe, 1st through 8th grades. I went to high school in Winnetka, which is about 4 miles away. All along, I was involved in integrated situations. When I grew up here, there were very few black families. In high school, there were only 4 blacks, 3 boys and 1 girl, in a class of 539. So I grew up in an atmosphere that didn't involve any overt prejudice. I don't know about the attitudes of all my classmates, but I didn't encounter any problems. I was accepted, and my attitude probably had a lot to do with it. I believe you should just live and let live. I wasn't looking for anybody to give me any trouble, and I wasn't giving anybody else any trouble. I was dark-skinned, and somebody else was white-skinned. It didn't matter to me. We did things together. In January of 1942, 1 month after Pearl Harbor, the Navy's General Board met in Washington to discuss the possibility of black men training for the general service ratings, allowing them to do more than just cook meals and clean floors. It was an idea that the NAACP and civil rights leaders and black colonists said was necessary if the United States were truly to stand on the side of democracy. But it was an idea that the top Navy brass considered a definite step backwards. Major General Thomas Holcomb, Commandant of the Marine Corps, called the enlistment of black men absolutely tragic, that's a direct quote, and told the General Board that African Americans had every opportunity, get this, quote, to satisfy their aspiration to serve by doing so in the Army. Their desire to enter the naval service, he said, was largely an effort to break into a club that doesn't want them. Despite misgivings from Navy leadership, and only after ordered by Roosevelt on April 7, 1942, the Navy announced that beginning that June, black sailors would be enlisted not only as messmen, but in the general service as well. On July 2nd, Secretary of Navy Frank Knox, pictured here, thrilled at the prospect, gives the oath of enlistment to 29-year-old William Baldwin of Washington, D.C. Baldwin became the first black to join the Naval Reserve under a new program permitting blacks to enlist for general service ratings. Watch the dates here. That was July 2nd. On July 7th, Frank Sublett enlisted in the Navy. He said, I turned 22 in March of 1942 and was a prime candidate for the draft after I left school, but I didn't want to go into the Army. I've always loved water, fishing, swimming, and boating, so I enlisted in the Navy on July 7th of that year. The Navy had just opened up the general service ratings for black sailors a month earlier, and that was also a big factor. I wasn't interested in being a cook or a steward's mate, and the change meant that I would have a wide range of other opportunities. I had a good tour of duty in my entire hitch in the Navy, starting out from boot camp on. I was in one of the early companies at Camp Robert Smalls, remember from the Civil War, at Great Lakes. The Naval Training Station was only a few miles north of my home, so I didn't have far to go. Once I was there, I had no trouble whatsoever adjusting to the Navy discipline and the way of life. I became an apprentice CPO, Chief Petty Officer, one of the leaders in the company in boot camp. I was evidently singled out as having leadership qualities that could have come from football, from track, general education, or maybe I inherited it from my mom or dad. Maybe it was a combination of all those. As part of my duties, I inspected both the recruits and the barracks. In the process, I encountered some young men whose backgrounds were far different from mine. I had to assist the men who did not know how to get clean. Some of those fellows came from places in the hills and didn't know what running water and good soap were. I helped teach the men about military bearing, general seamanship, and cleanliness. I knew about knots and so forth from my Boy Scout experience. I called cadence when we drilled and marched. Some of the men didn't know their right from their left. Some of the young men were illiterate. I was about the same age as most of the men in my company, but definitely had more education. That was undoubtedly a factor in my being chosen to lead the group. That leads to this picture. One of the interesting things about boot camp was that we slept in hammocks that were lashed up to vertical stanchions in our barracks. Men still slept in hammocks in many Navy ships at the time, and this was a way of preparing for shipboard duty. It took a little time to get used to sleeping this way. Every night, somebody hit the deck. They were told to make the hammock taut in the stays. A lot of fellows were afraid of falling on the deck, and they wanted to sleep with a sway in the hammock because they thought it was more comfortable. Sure enough, they'd flip out of it. They'd have sore backs, they'd urinate in the hammocks. Sleeping in that kind of position started the kidneys. That took some getting used to, for some. In September of 1942, Frank Sublett successfully completed his boot camp training. 222 of the first 277 enlistees successfully completed that training. 102 of those graduates were chosen to continue specialized training, and the rest of the class was assigned to routine duties. Frank was assigned to continue on at the Hampton Institute in Virginia. He was assigned to what he was described as essentially a Navy vocational training school in Hampton, Virginia. My aptitude tests indicated that my talent was in machinery. I was delighted to get the opportunity to become a machinist mate because I was good at something which I truly enjoyed doing. The biggest adjustment I had to make in getting used to the Navy was in the racial area. Both my boot training and service schools were all black. These were my first experiences with all black people. Some of the guys used to tease me about the way I talked because they came from areas in the South, and I grew up here on the North Shore with an accent that was different from everyone else's. While at Hampton, I developed an excellent relationship with Commander Downs, who was the officer in charge of the school. He gave me a wonderful compliment one day. I've forgotten exactly how he put it, but he told me that he wished one thing in life, and that would be that his son Hall would grow up to be as fine a gentleman as I. I thought that was the greatest thing I'd ever heard. He was a very fine gentleman himself. He contacted my mother personally and told her of my progress. Sublett graduated from the machinist school at Hampton, and he became a second-class machinist mate. He was shipped up to East Boston to work in a Navy machine shop, and that was his first integrated Navy assignment. And then something very significant for Frank Sublett happened in September of 1943, although he didn't know it at the time. Even as some barriers fell, there was one that remained. There were still no black Navy officers. There was also growing political pressure on the President and the Navy Secretary to rectify what seemed to be a glaring blemish. Adlai Stevenson, pictured on the right here, the future two-time Democratic nominee for President, convinced Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox that the situation was untenable. Stevenson, at the time, was Knox's speechwriter and confidant, and he told his boss, who was an efficiency expert, that keeping black men out of the officer corps was now unquestionably inefficient. There were 60,000 black men in the Navy, and 12,000 more were entering every month. Stevenson wrote to Knox on September 29, 1943, quote, "Obviously this cannot go on indefinitely without accepting some officers or trying to explain why we don't." Stevenson said, "I feel very emphatically that we should commission a few Negroes." Knox assented. 3 months later, 16 men entered a training program at Great Lakes. Out of approximately 100,000 black sailors available at the time of selection. Frank Sublett was one of those 16 out of the 100,000. 16 men were summoned to the white side of the segregated Great Lakes Training Naval Center in January of 1944. The rationale for training 16 men was that officer training programs, including the Naval Academy, generally lose a certain percentage of candidates, so some extra men were included to reach the desired total of 12. The Navy had expected a quarter of the men would not pass the course. 3 men passed but were not commissioned, and they remained on active duty as enlisted men and were reassigned to other duties within the Navy, hence you get the Golden 13. The significance of this cannot be understated. Author of one of the books about the Golden 13 characterized it this way. He said, "Americans may have fought against racism abroad during World War II, but one of the most consequential battles in the war for equality took place 35 miles north of Chicago in a Spartan barracks that held 16 cots, 16 chairs, and 1 long table." I'm going to read to you from Frank's recollections. Some of this also includes recollections from other members of the men who went through it. I think it's really important for us all to understand what these men went through in 2.5 months' time. Giving black men a chance did not mean they'd be given equal treatment. Great Lakes Naval Training Station was home to an elite service school with plenty of equipment that could aid their training, but the 16 candidates saw almost none of that. They trained separately from all other sailors, drilled apart, and ate alone, living in their own barracks in the segregated section of the station, essentially under house arrest. The officer corps was ready to be integrated. Great Lakes Naval Training Center was not. Lieutenant Paul Richmond, who designed the curriculum, was particularly hard on the men, and they later said, Richmond, in his own words, that he had no malicious intent. He wanted to make the course as tough as he could because he knew the men would be scrutinized once they graduated and because he had so much to teach in such a short period of time. Richmond, who at age 23 was younger than all of the men taking the course, relied on his experience at the Naval Academy to build the program. Making it difficult, being rough, callous, even indifferent, was how you molded men into officers. Their days began at 6 a.m., 6 mornings a week. They rose from their cots and donned their enlisted man's uniform. Once dressed, the men marched to chow and were seated and eating by 6:30 a.m. After breakfast, they lined up for a muster and sick call, ready for the rigors of another day. On Monday and Wednesday mornings, the officer candidates drilled for 4 hours until lunch. On Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday mornings, they took classes in seamanship, gunnery, navigation, naval law, and Navy regulations. On Saturdays, there was a course in navigation, followed by an inspection of the barracks before lunch, and then a class in gunnery. There were quizzes most afternoons, followed by an hour of exercise. Thursday afternoons were devoted to drilling. Dinner was from 5 to 6. On Wednesday, they were free for the rest of the evening, but every other night of the week was set aside for study. Many felt that the teachers acted as if they thought they were gods trying to pass on wisdom to a hopelessly inferior group who, with much patience, might learn a fraction of what was being taught. They didn't seem all that interested in whether the men passed, failed, or learned anything at all. Sublett was certain that some of the teachers felt their efforts were a waste of time because no one expected black men to succeed. There was a 6-part lecture series on the current war in Europe, intended to establish a pattern of the war for the indoctrinee. It was essentially a European history class. The men studied the 19th century empires and conflicts that explained the rise of fascism and Adolf Hitler. The men also studied the history of the U.S. Navy beginning in 1775. They learned the history of signal flags, how they were used on ships during the 12th century, how the colonies used them during the Revolutionary War, and how their meaning had evolved down to the present day. Time was spent on the firing range practicing with 20mm guns and on the anti-aircraft simulator that gave them training in the use of 40mm guns. They trained in distance swimming and swimming fully clothed. They had abandoned ship and lifeguard drills. They learned how to fashion life preservers from trousers, mattress covers, hats, and ditty bags. They studied the science of boxing. They memorized nautical terminology. They attended lectures on leadership and expected conduct. There was a class on naval courts and procedures, and when men were quizzed on summary court-martials and general court-martials. They were quizzed on traditions, customs, military insignia, as well as on Navy history and the different types of warships. The pace was brutal. The men were supposed to be in bed with lights out by 10:30 every night, but well past that hour, the 16 candidates sat together in the bathroom, flashlights in hand, studying the lessons of the past day and preparing for the day ahead. They draped sheets over the windows so no one outside would notice the light. They were intent on proving that their selection was justified. Even their toughest instructors weren't as demanding of them as they were of themselves. So when the men went to class the next day, there was little a teacher could do to catch them off guard. They'd average 5 or 6 hours of shut-eye a night, but sleep was never scheduled. Sublett described the training as pure hell. Despite the 20-hour days, the ridicule, and the racism, the 16 candidates never outwardly showed any signs of dissent. They knew that losing their temper would give credence to the pervasive belief that black men lacked the demeanor necessary for command. As their training drew to a close in March of 1944, the group was posting grades like no other officer class in history. Their marks were so good that some in Washington did not believe they could be real. The men were forced to take some exams again, and they scored even higher the second time, eventually earning a collective 3.89 out of 4.0 for the entire course. Toward the end of their 10-week course, when it became obvious that all of them would not only pass, but pass with flying colors, the Navy said it would commission only 12 of the 16 men, and a 13th would be made a warrant officer, meaning he'd be above a non-commissioned man, but still below ensign's, the lowest officer rank. No official explanation was given for this decision. Whatever the reason, the result was that the first black class, a group that had posted higher marks than any class before it, would have the same pass rate as an average class of white officer candidates. The 16 men were told that 3 would be dropped, but not which 3. Instead, men were excused to be processed into officer ranks one by one, while the others sat nervous and dejected, waiting to see who would be cast off. Sublett said, at the end of the training, 3 of the men in the program were dropped. I'll never know why. The rest of us had no graduation ceremonies whatsoever. We were probably the only group of officers that got commissions but had no graduation exercises of any sort. One interesting thing was that a photo of the group was taken for Life magazine. It's this photo on the right, which was then a very popular weekly magazine. We were pictured there because we were a novelty. And I would have to say that what we accomplished has achieved more importance in retrospect than we thought at the time. After he graduated, he got orders as an officer, and he discovered that the Navy really didn't use him as well as it could have. To put it bluntly, Sublett said, we got menial jobs. Although I didn't have a choice of duty initially, my previous association with Commander Dowse was useful. I know that he wanted John Reagan, one of the other 13, and me back at Hampton, so we were both assigned there. I was put in charge of a company of 250 students. It was similar to the group I had been a part of when I was down there the first time. I instructed in small boat handling, seamanship, military bearing, and that sort of thing. I executed the duties of a commanding officer for this company. One completely new aspect of our status had to do with the relationship between black officers and white enlisted men. The students were all black, but a number of the others assigned to the school as instructors or clerical personnel were white. Obviously, there was no basis of experience, so I decided just to take it one day at a time. I will say I was never involved in any maltreatment or disrespect. I know I didn't have the attitude that if somebody didn't salute me, that I was going to put him on report. That's just part of my live and let live philosophy. After Hampton, he went aboard a yard oiler, YO 106, pictured here, where I served with Graham Martin, another member of the Golden 13. The YO could have been run by a first-class boatswain's mate. It didn't need one commissioned officer, let alone two. But that was a place for the Navy to stick us. Still, it was good duty because the oiler had a legitimate role. Typically, we went to an oil refinery, picked up oil, and went alongside battleships, as you can sort of see here in this picture. Aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and all sorts of other ships to refuel them day and night. We had a couple of white kids on that vessel. They were capable, and they respected us. Everybody got along together as a crew, and there was teamwork. That was the only mixed crew that I was involved with as an officer. Frank Sublett was promoted to the rank of lieutenant junior grade, and on July 18, 1945, he was sent to Enewetak, I'm probably saying that wrong, in the Marshall Islands. Several of the Golden 13 were reunited there when they were assigned to the Logistics Support Company 515. The picture on the right is an actual picture of that logistics support company. It was essentially a group of about 200 black stevedores. Unloading supplies from ships was the main duty of this outfit. Occasionally we loaded. We were making preparations collectively for the invasion of Japan. There was a huge setup for the gathering of all types of ships and weaponry for the invasion. I was the executive officer and supply officer. We had a nice group over there. It was good duty, actually. You can see him pictured in the photo on the left with his other Golden 13 classmates. As the time for the invasion of Japan drew closer, the buildup of Navy ships in the lagoon was absolutely massive. I was envious of the men serving in those ships. We were quite shocked when the word came in early August that the Army Air Forces had dropped atomic bombs on Japan. We were happy, of course, that we didn't have to go and lose a lot of lives over there. The war was over and we had survived. I hadn't been exposed to the danger that a lot of people had, yet I believe I did my share. I know that I helped to train some people who did get involved in combat. I was never given a chance to do more. I don't say that defensively, merely as a statement of fact. I did enjoy my Navy time from start to finish. As I've told many people, if I could do it all over again, I would. Sublett was released from active duty on February 11, 1946, but remained a member of the U.S. Naval Reserve until his honorable discharge on October 27, 1952. The first reunion for the surviving members of the first 13 was held in Berkeley, California in 1977. It was during this first reunion that the Golden 13 first came face to face with their legacy. Most of them had never seen more than a handful of black officers in one room. But at the get-together in Berkeley, there were dozens of black faces, lieutenants, captains, and even an admiral. And they all walked over to the Golden 13 to pay their respects and salute these trailblazers. We owe it all to you. One after the next said, if it hadn't been for you guys, we wouldn't be here. Frank Sublett was the last surviving member of the Golden 13. He said he wanted badly to serve in a fighting ship during World War II, and he didn't get to. But we all have unfulfilled wishes. All in all, I have no complaints. It's been a good life. Looking back on it, being in the Navy was the outstanding thing that happened to me in my lifetime. That leaves us with one last segment of the military to break the color barrier, and that's the Marines. And once again, we'll go through the history of black military service in the Marines, but guess what, folks? That's real quick. In 1796, James McHenry, Secretary of War, said no Negro, mulatto, or Indian is to be recruited into the Marine Corps. And that held for the next 150 so years. In April of 1941, Major General Thomas Holcomb, we heard from him before, but this is an even better quote, said, quote, "If it was a question of having a Marine Corps of 5,000 whites or 500,000 Negroes, I would rather have the whites. There could be no black Marines because the Corps was simply too small to form segregated units. There would be a definite loss of efficiency. The Negro race has every opportunity now to satisfy its aspirations for combat in the Army," something he told the Navy Board too. In June of 1941, we've talked about it before, was Executive Order 8802. This was the order in which Roosevelt banned discrimination in the defense industry. With World War II raging overseas, FDR became concerned with national security. America had 350,000 troops, while Hitler's military exceeded 2 million in the Western Front alone. During the summer of 1940, Congress approved $12 million in defense spending, and with Americans still out of work due to the Great Depression, this created many jobs, but defense contractors denied Negroes employment. Civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph met with Roosevelt asking for equal military and industry job opportunities. And unsatisfied with Roosevelt's response, Randolph organized a march on Washington for July 1st, 1941, for equal treatment. At Eleanor Roosevelt's urging, FDR signed Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in defense contracting, a mere week before the planned march. General Ray Robinson said, "Eleanor says we gotta take in Negroes, and we are just scared to death. We've never had any. We don't know how to handle them, and we're afraid of them." So we get to breaking the final military color barrier in the Marines, and there's a place in Camp Lejeune, in a corner of Camp Lejeune, called Montford Point. And this is where it happened. In August of 1942, the first black recruits arrived at a hastily constructed Montford Point. Most of the recruits had no expectations. They knew it was going to be rough. In 2012, Lieutenant General Walter E. Gaskin, a Marine, reflected back on that moment. He said, quote, "You can't think of being a Marine without thinking about the Montford Pointers, because they are the beginning. You often have to question yourself, could I have had the perseverance to come and join an organization that first didn't want me, and second, that was the last to integrate?" And there's where we get to Wilson Rankin. A third-generation Glencoe resident, Wilson Rankin was born in Glencoe in 1917, the youngest of 6 children of William and Sarah Wilson Rankin. He attended Glencoe schools and New Trier High School, spending his free time delivering morning and evening newspapers and working at a Kenilworth drugstore. He was an altar boy at St. Paul AME Church, where he later became a trustee. As a young man, he joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was building the Skokie Lagoons to aid in flood control in our area. On December 29th, 1943, Wilson Rankin enlisted in the Marines. He said, "I told them I didn't want the Army or the Navy, but rather the Marines. They looked at me as if I were crazy, but that's where I ended up." They were assigned to live in prefabricated huts at Montford Point, which provided little protection against the temperatures and animals. When new facilities were built by the first recruits, they would barely meet living standards, consisting of a single door, few windows, and a coal heater in the center of a room for 40 men. They washed their own dishes outside. They had no gym to exercise or play sports. This is the picture on the right, shows them washing the dishes outside. Even though they were all Marines, the blacks were kept separate. They didn't have barracks. They lived in prefabricated huts built from cardboard painted green. The whites at Camp Lejeune had barracks. You can see those on the right. But the blacks had huts. They were located in the backwoods amid water snakes and bears. Hostilities faced on the base were amplified by Jacksonville locals. On leave from the base, the laws of Jim Crow overrode the fact that they were government employees. They confronted the brunt of Southern discrimination. Jacksonville police looked for reason to arrest and beat them, which shocked many Northern Montford Point soldiers. The recruits were trained by white drill sergeants, often chosen because of their views toward blacks. Some treated them fairly, others riddled them with unpleasantries. The training was more rigorous for blacks than for whites. Every day they had responsibility to prove that they were just as capable as a white Marine. There's a quote from a white drill instructor who said, "I came here to undertake the impossible assignment of making Marines out of you goddamn people. The Marine Corps is not for cooks and janitors, which is about all you are qualified to do." Rankin was promoted to drill instructor, and most of the Marines that he trained ended up being sent to the South Pacific. Although few saw any combat, when they did, it was only because the white Marines had been so overwhelmed that help of any type was needed and gratefully accepted. Corporal Rankin was discharged and returned home to Glencoe on May 15, 1946. It would take another program to describe all the things that Wilson Rankin did for our community after he returned home. He was a public servant in the very best sense of the word. GHS is honored to display his duffel and his dress uniform in our exhibit, and we extend our deepest thanks to his widow, Effie Rankin, who cared for these materials. The uniform that we have on display looks like it could have been purchased just last week. The legacy of the Montford Point Marines is profound. General James F. Amos, the 35th Commandant of the Marine Corps, summed up that legacy when he said, "The battle that took place from 1939 to 1945 for world freedom has been referred to as America's War. But while American troops fought the horror of World War II, the Montford Point Marines fought a second battle, one for equal treatment." Wilson Rankin was part of that battle, as were the other three men that we talked about tonight: Frank Sublett for the Navy, Roger Brown, and William Loving in the Army Air Corps. GHS salutes all of our veterans and extends our heartfelt thanks for their service. I thank you all for listening tonight. I encourage you to come to our exhibit. We are open on Wednesdays from 10 to 3 and on Sundays from 1 to 4. And by appointment, we've done a lot of private tours. So anybody that needs to, please just contact us and we're happy to do that. And if there are any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't have a question at all. You covered it beautifully, but I just want to say thank you for doing such a not only thorough job, but just a warm and lovely representation of just being raised in Glencoe and being here still. I love the way you represented people from that. Thank you.
We are really an extraordinary community when you think about it, a community of right now a little over 8,000 people. And you know, back in the 1940s, we weren't quite that large, and to have 4 men play such pivotal roles in each of the military services, I think it goes to the character of the community, the character of these men and the character of the community in which they lived. Yeah.
I came up with a group of visitors on Wednesday and toured the exhibit in the Historical Museum, which is really why we're here tonight, because I was very impressed. I didn't know any of their history, and the way that it unfolded was surprising to me. And very, part of it is very sobering, and part of it is very uplifting. Thank you for doing that work.
There are people here that
Yes.
research that as well, and I join you. I think it was, of all the things we've done, I think this is one of the most significant projects that we've undertaken, and we've been able to add to the collection at GHS with a lot of new material that we didn't know before, and we've learned that there's still a lot left for us to learn. Yeah.
What are the places where the researchers generally go to for something like that?
That could be another whole program in and of itself too. We kind of affectionately call it the research rabbit hole, because a lot of times we start looking for something and we find a lot of things that we didn't realize we needed to know on the way. We use a lot of digital resources, we use library resources. Help me, guys.
Well, a lot of automation now makes it easier, something you can use at home, ancestry.com, but we have to have that kind of basic stuff. Who lived here when, and where, and how old were they? So there's information that we could use, because while we did this, the pandemic came in. Cook County shut down access to all the files that we had hoped to be able to learn more from.
Well, a lot of times it's connecting dots. We have files in our own collection, and they have dates and they have things that just independently stand alone don't mean anything. But when you start to research some of these things and you start to find out more of the details, you can connect the dots and put together time and place and people, and all of a sudden the story becomes much more full.
Are a lot of the military records digitized, or did you have to trip to Washington?
You know, the military records are a dicey thing. There was a fire in St. Louis in the 1980s or 90s that destroyed a lot of the military records. And so it's a hit or miss thing in terms of requesting them from the government. Also, it has to be more than, 65 or 75 years since the service person was discharged, or they won't, they'll only give it to family. So in many of these instances, some of what we learned came from family, from research. In the case of Mr. Sublett, God bless the U.S. Navy. They did oral histories of those 13 men before they passed away, and we have in their words all about their experiences, which is so much more powerful than any of us could ever hope to write.
Well, also including our oral history of Wilson Rankin.
That's true too. Yeah, we have oral histories at GHS, and Wilson Rankin, you need to go listen to his oral history, because when you think of a Marine drill sergeant, and particularly that quote I gave of the white drill sergeant, you think of a very gruff person who's barking out orders, and Wilson Rankin was one of the soft-spoken, sweetest people. I never had the privilege of meeting him in person, but I've listened to his both his video history and his oral history, and he was a very soft-spoken, kind, generous, very helpful person. Again, it says to me a lot about his character, that he wanted to be one of the first Marines, and yet it didn't change him at all.
Does the Historical Society have any original documents from any of these individuals? Like a diary or anything that is in the collection?
In the collection, Effie loaned us some of Wilson's Marine artifacts, which are on display. There wasn't a diary, there was a Bible, there's a ID card, there's some other materials like that. But we do not, as in terms of artifacts, have those. But I encourage anybody who has a aunt, uncle, grandparent, or somebody from Glencoe who's going to clean out their attic or their basement and finds things to pass them on to us. That's how we do. We do have some artifacts for not our black military, but Abel Davis. We have a collection that was given to us from his relatives that does include some of his military artifacts.
And sometimes when people visit, they tell us stories, and we're able to dive in on something, and we created a whole new program after we opened the exhibit about one guy in particular, John Burton, who lived in Glencoe, and we didn't know anything about him. And it's fascinating. It was with Chess Records and handled people really famous in the blues scenes.
I was going to say one thing. Mr. Sublett came back to Glencoe and was whatever his training was in mechanic, was a mechanic at one of the car dealerships along the Eames Expressway for years.
And actually, yeah, and John, if you want to tell it, John, go ahead. You
My
can tell.
favorite factoid of the whole thing was that one of the ways that he made a living after coming back was he was a model.
Yes.
Yeah.
He
He's very
He
attractive.
was very good looking.
no, he did. He did modeling for the newspapers and the department stores and that kind of magazines and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, all of our breaking the color barrier servicemen were very handsome guys.
The thing about him working at Eames, you have to understand at times there were no blacks working in those kind of jobs at that time that he came back. So that's another feather in his cap, so to speak.
Broken like a color barrier.
Yeah. I think it was a Buick dealership. I can't
I think
remember
it
which
was
one it
Buick.
was, but it was a Buick. And he
Maybe
was one of the head
his
guys.
service record helped him get
Yeah.
in there.
Right.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Karen.